A very good afternoon. I'm Dr. Astha Takkar Kapila and I shall be presenting on neurology, immunology, and women. So, before I begin, I'll want to quote this Nobel laureate, Sir Peter Medawar, who said that the human mind treats any new idea just the way the body treats a strange protein. It rejects it. So, if this strange protein is an infectious particle, it is known as immunity. And when this strange protein is body's own particle, we call it autoimmunity. One of the interesting aspects is that brain, for a very long time, was considered to be immunoprivileged thanks to the blood-brain barrier, which was considered to be a savior for brain and stopping any type of immune response to travel inside the brain. But what was hiding in the hindsight was the fact that the brain itself has an immune system, which we today call G lymphatic system. More so, the neuroinflammation can occur when the body's immune system travels to the brain through various paths. So, when it is against the infections, it is considered good. But when it's against the brain's own cells, which is the autoimmunity of the brain against the brain, it is known as the science of neuroimmunology. And hence comes the concept of the neurovascular unit and the neuroimmune connections and the endothelium, brainstem, and circumventricular organs being the prime organs controlling this neuroimmunology. So, what we today know is that there are various diseases which are known to be neuroimmunological diseases like multiple sclerosis, other demyelinating immune syndromes like neuromyelitis optica, spectrum disorders, autoimmune encephalitis, and other systemic vasculitis which can have bearings with neurological concerns. So, why this topic? Why neuroimmunology and women? So, women or a female's brain across the lifespan undergoes lots of neuroplasticity. And due to the various stages of life, like a younger age, menarche, then pregnancy, lactation, menopause, and post-menopause time. So actually, there are lots of hormonal changes which are undergoing, which have significant bearing on immunology per se and neuroimmunology as well, which is which should be known by all the physicians also. So why these changes? So the estrogen per se is known to affect the brain's transmission or brain's excitation through a direct and through an indirect pathway, leading on to stimulation or excitement of glutaminergic, GABAergic, serotonergic, and dopaminergic pathways, which in the end are responsible for myelination, neural pruning, dendritic spine remodeling, etc. Hence, building up or making up major changes causing neuroplasticity and neuromodulation. Estrogens also stimulate B cells, T cells, and dendritic cells, NK cells, etc., which are directly responsible for modulation of cytokines, and hence it leads on to the immune responses or immune changes, which can very well affect the brain as well. So I start with multiple sclerosis, which is the most commonly considered or most widely known to be a neuroimmunological disorder. Multiple sclerosis is a chronic inflammatory demyelinating disorder which is characterized by focal neurological deficits, which, if are resulting or if are occurring in relapsing remitting manners, is known as relapsing remitting MS. If after some period of relapsing remitting, it goes on to progress, it is known as secondary progressive MS. And if these disorders are primarily progressive disorders, it is known as primary progressive MS. So interesting to note that this immune disorder is widely more common in women, specifically the women of reproductive age group as compared to the men. So the ratio when we see from females to female ratio, it's around 3 is to 1, occurring more commonly in women. But men, typically, if they are affected, they are having or they usually have progressive disease with lesser survival as compared to their female counterparts. Intriguing are these differences which make women more prone to develop MS at any time of life. So, first we have genetic factors. While it is well known that HLA-DRB1 is considered to be associated with around 10% higher genetic risk of developing MS, it's also interesting to know that few single nucleotide polymorphisms are exclusively occurring or they exclusively occur on X chromosomes and hence causing different expression of genes on X chromosomes, which can even affect T cells. So, hence, these particular representation of these polymorphisms on X chromosome makes these chromosomes more susceptible to develop MS. Then we have a few hormonal changes. As I was talking in some time back, that a woman undergoes various changes across her lifespan. So the effect of estrogen at various at various times during a woman's life can cause estrogen-dependent dose effect and hence make a woman more prone to develop multiple sclerosis or other immune disorders like this. So it's interesting to note that younger women or the patients who develop menarche at a younger age or who are nulliparous are more prone to develop or were seen to develop multiple sclerosis in a higher proportion as compared to their counterparts who develop later menarche or who have higher number of childbirths. It's another important factor is this biphasic estrogen dose effect. So it is seen that at lower doses, estrogen is immunostimulatory, like we see, like in younger menarche, as against to a higher dose estrogen, which is secreted during pregnancy, which is rather immunoprotective. And during pregnancy, the chances of development of multiple sclerosis markedly goes down. Though environmental factors do exist, and lower vitamin D, sunlight exposure, and heavy smoking leads on to more development of multiple sclerosis, assisted reproductive techniques, imposing a woman or giving women higher GnRH or higher hormonal background is associated with higher annualized relapse rates of multiple sclerosis. Oral contraceptives are associated with contrasting data of development of multiple sclerosis. And then we have gender-based microbiota differences. We now know that human gut microbiome is associated with the development of multiple sclerosis. It is also known that gender-specific interferon responses have been seen by those gut microbiomes and hence making women more susceptible to develop multiple sclerosis. I think this is a very intriguing fact that during pregnancy, when there is a fetus inside woman's womb, it is almost like a semi-allogenic fetus. So it's half of it is allogenic to the woman's body and half of it is not. So this gives woman or this entails or this leads on to development of these specific HLAs or NK cells which stop the usual immune reactions, hence giving pregnancy the immunoprivileged status. So the usual immune cells which are there or which get triggered are not triggered during pregnancy and are rather stopped. And hence during pregnancy, the modulation of this innate and adaptive immunity gives a woman a fetal friendly phenotype. It is known that the risk of MS goes down to only around one third of what the woman would be having. I mean to say that the relapse rates go down to around one third of the usual relapse rate of a patient with MS. It's also interesting to know that during the last trimester, there is around 70% reduction of the relapses which may occur during a patient's MS or the patient's usual disease. The rebound increase is seen during the postpartum state after the pregnancy ends. So you have to be considerate of these facts that during pregnancy there is a marked reduction in relapses of multiple sclerosis, and the moment the patient delivers, postpartum period is associated with a rebound increase in the relapses which may occur in MS. Another important aspect of treating in the women with multiple sclerosis is the selection of our disease-modifying therapy. Though we now know that glatiramer acetate interferons can be used during pregnancy in selected cases, it is better to stop the medications the moment the patient conceives. Now, as I've already discussed that there's around one third reduction or there's only around one third of risk which is left to a woman as compared to her whatever earlier relapses used to be. This decision to give therapy or not to give therapy has to be tailored as per the patient's disease as well as per the patient's risk to the various immunomodulating drugs patient was taking. So as such, teriflunomide, natalizumab or fingolimod are associated with high teratogenic risks and hence they should not be used in patients or they should be avoided in patients who are planning conception. Dimethyl fumarate interferons can be given in the preconception period and should be stopped the moment the patient becomes pregnant. Only a few drugs like glatiramar or interferons can be continued during pregnancy, and only if we are suspecting a very aggressive disease. So there have been a few papers which consider hormonal therapy for multiple sclerosis per se, given the potential of estrogen or high doses of estrogen, like in pregnancy, causing reduction in the relapse rates in multiple sclerosis. Though this data is very controversial, it's just as a like I'm just mentioning it to show you that the hormonal therapies are even coming as newer treatment in multiple sclerosis. So another important aspect is the stigma or depression or anxiety issues which are associated in these women with multiple sclerosis. We have various societies now which are working specifically on the associated anxiety issues or depression issues in these patients with multiple sclerosis, specifically the women. So now just let's see the small example. This 26 years old lady comes to us with headache and visual loss. So she clearly had optic neuritis of 5 days duration, but she also has another episode of right upper limb numbness for 5 days duration. Now you can note over here that the patient is having optic neuritis. The fundus is showing disc edema or papillitis. The optic nerve is showing you haziness and a little contrast enhancement. And this is the brain's MRI, which is showing you typical hyperintensity on T2 weighted images, on sagittal images along the corpus callosum. They are perpendicular, vertical, and this is the typical appearance of Dawson's fingers. And these are these T2 hyperintensities on axial brain images. So little doubt is left that this patient is having MS. But important to notice that many other neuroimmune demyelinating disorders can just come like this. And then we get in and then comes the role of suspecting the other neuroimmune demyelinating disorders under this background. So now this is another example just to show you as against the previous example. Now this is a 49 years old female who presents with headache, pain and diminution of vision, both eyes. And now in this patient, look at the fundus. So it is like very easily known that this patient is having a retrobulbar neuritis and already optic atrophy is developed. You can also note the extent to which the vision loss has already developed. You can note the thick enhancement or the florid enhancement and florid thickening of the optic nerve. It's almost like a cord-like optic nerve. And you can also note that this patient went on to develop progressive weakness of bilateral lower limbs. And hence, when the MRI spine was done, you can notice over here a longitudinally extensive transverse myelitis. So this is typically involving a long or a longitudinally extensive transverse myelitis along with a bad optic neuritis or a very severe form of optic neuritis. So this is typically how patients of neuromyelitis optica present to us. So while neuromyelitis optica can look like MS in many of forms, there are typical diagnostic criteria which have come over past 20 years, which can help us differentiate neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders from a typical patient of MS. So just in short, when we have episodes of optic neuritis and acute transverse myelitis with positive neuromyelitis optica antibodies seropositive status, it is neuromyelitis optica. So these are specific areas in brain which are affected by this disorder: the brain stem, the spinal cord, and the optic nerves. And just to mention, the core criteria now include these areas as clinical symptoms as well. So a patient who's presenting to us with optic neuritis, acute myelitis, area postrema or brainstem syndrome can very well be having neuromyelitis optica, and help can be taken by these antibodies, the aquaporin 4 antibodies and the MOG antibodies, to diagnose the patients of neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders. It's again interesting to note that these patients are again more frequently women, and the chance of a woman to develop neuromyelitis optica is 9 times higher than a chance for male to develop this disorder. So again, we have similar problems that we need to select disease modifying therapies judiciously in women, keeping in mind the pregnancy issues, keeping in mind the teratogenic issues, and hence we are left with choices like azathioprine and rituximab while treating these patients. It is also intriguing to know that the women with the aquaporin 4 positivity and the women with longer inter-interval attack, or old age women, or women with less severe motor involvement, are more associated with the frequent or with the more severe varieties of neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders. Another important entities in this neuroimmunology series is autoimmune encephalitis. So this book by Suzanne Callan was very famous when she wrote about her own experience of NMDA encephalitis. She wrote this term that a brain is a monstrous and a beautiful mess. Why? Because of this presentation of autoimmune encephalitis, which usually confuses a neurologist or a physician by its varied presentation. So what is autoimmune encephalitis? Putting it into simpler form, it is a group of disorders characterized by symptoms of limbic, extralimbic, basal ganglia, autonomic structures, or rather any structure of the brain which is associated with specific autoantibodies. Important part is that now we know so many antibodies which can be associated with this variety of a rapidly progressive dementia or rapidly progressive behavioral syndrome. It is interesting to note that this autoimmune encephalitis per se can be divided into two major varieties. One is the one associated with malignancies, when we call these antibodies as onconeural antibodies. These are usually directed against the intracellular antigens. The response is usually a T cell mediated response, and this response is usually associated with a lot of neuronal loss and hence a poorer prognosis. As against the classical variety of autoimmune encephalitis, which is not associated with malignancies, and this variety is typically associated with extra production of antibodies which are directed against extracellular domains of channels or receptors, as it is not associated with any neurology or any neuronal loss per se. It is usually reversible and is associated with a good prognosis. The intriguing aspect of autoimmune encephalitis is that a patient may have a normal MRI, a normal EEG, normal CSF, and even at times normal antibodies. So many at times a clinical suspicion in a patient of rapidly progressive dementia, a clinical suspicion based upon a mixture of odd CNS symptoms and maybe supportive diagnosis or supportive investigations like FDG or whole body FDG PET can give us a clue that this patient can be having autoimmune encephalitis. Interestingly, anything can be affected inside the brain, including the gray area, the gray matter, the white matter, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the major lobes of the brain as well. So you can just note over here the type of clinical symptomatology these patients may have: behavioral symptoms, dementia, ataxia, movement disorders, seizures, dysautonomia, and even neuromyotonia, even involvement of peripheral nervous system, even neuropathy, even anterior horn cell involvement. So because of this diverse clinical syndrome or diverse clinical symptomatology, many a times diagnosis is delayed. And many a patients are often considered to be having psychiatric diseases because they are not localizing to a particular anatomical substrate. You can note over here that they have a biphasic presentation. Usually at the earlier age, the autoimmune encephalitis associated with NMDA antibodies is predominant, and during the latter period in the life, the other antibodies like VGKC or LGI1 associated antibodies are more prevalent. I have just marked over here in yellow the incidence in females as compared to their male counterparts. And you can note that across the ages, across the types of various autoimmune encephalitis, there is high predisposition for a female to develop autoimmune encephalitis as well. So this is a small example of a patient who presented with jerky movements and gait disturbance of only 8 days old. Just note the patient's age, 14 years. So now this patient was having a typical cerebellar syndrome. So these were spontaneous ocular flutter and square wave jerks. And you can notice over here the startle myoclonus which this patient was having. And I will forward this video to when this patient is shown to be having ataxia. So this patient was having NMDA encephalitis, which was autoimmune encephalitis, which was antibody negative. And the clue was here. The patient was having an ovarian teratoma, which is very closely associated in patients of NMDA encephalitis. And you can see over here that this patient improved markedly after being given plasma exchange and rituximab, and the patient almost completely improved. At the given moment, this patient is herself pursuing an MBBS degree. So this is the way, this is the marked improvement these patients can have if treated well in time. So this is another example of a patient who was being treated outside as a patient of psychiatric disturbance only because she had a failure exam, or only because she failed in an exam, was having a few behavioral abnormalities, and was taking repeated psychiatric consults due to these abnormalities. Only when the patient developed a GTCS and altered sensorium was she referred to us. And this is the status in which the patient had come to us. Now, interestingly, this patient was having some mild T2 hyperintensity in the medial temporal lobe, was found to have an ovarian teratoma, you can see in this FDG PET image, and was an MDA receptor antibody positive. And this patient had a marked improvement after being fully treated with steroids, plasma exchange. She was also given IVIG and subsequently rituximab. This patient also underwent removal of ovarian mass, and after 6 months, she was all set to go to her school. So these patients are often found to have these abnormal dyskinetic movements. You can notice over here, this is almost like a hallmark of the patients who present to us with NMDA encephalitis. This is a typical orofacial dyskinesias. So these patients, as I was mentioning, can have mesial temporal lobe hyperintensities, as is seen in these MRIs, or can just have normal MRIs. So the index of suspicion needs to be very high. You can note over here that these patients are associated, or they usually have ovarian teratomas, but these ovarian teratomas also only exist during this period, during this age group of around 18 to 30 years of age. Before and afterwards, both the proportion of patients, of female patients with tumors is less. Then we have this another example of a patient who presented with extrapyramidal Parkinsonic symptoms, but was subsequently found to have an paraneoplastic. It was found that all this extrapyramidal presentation was due to NT-associated autoimmune encephalitis, or rather, this would be a paraneoplastic encephalitis. This patient was having a tumor. She was having a metastatic carcinoma breast, which was treated, but the patient could not make it. The patient lived for 6 months, and then we were informed about the patient's demise despite best possible treatment she received. So the management in these cases is usually removal of the substrate. If you see ovarian teratoma, try to remove it. If you see a malignancy, the first bet is to remove it. And then we have induction therapies with IVIG, plasma exchange, or pulse methylprednisolone, followed by continuation phase with rituximab, with the repeated pulse methylprednisolone, and at times use of cyclophosphamide, drugs like mycophenolate, azathioprine, and high-dose methotrexate. In short span of time, I would just want to show that another aspect of neuroimmunology is the neurological interpretation or neurological presentations of various systemic vasculitis. We all know vasculitis is vascular inflammation affecting vessels of various sizes. So just see this example. An old woman comes to us with headache and jaw pain and sudden loss of vision from both eyes. And when we do a temporal artery biopsy, we happen to see these intimal proliferations, break in elastic lamina, extravasation of RBCs in tunica media, telling us that this was a patient of giant cell arteritis. So even giant cell arteritis and other vasculitis are much more common in women. Any new localized headache in a patient of more than 50 years of age with a history of systemic signs like fever, anorexia, weight loss, scalp tenderness, polymyalgia, jaw claudication, and sudden vision loss suggestive of ischemic optic neuropathy should immediately alert a physician for giant cell arteritis. So another important aspect is neurolupus. So while we know lupus is extremely common in women of childbearing age, also important to know is the extent to which neuropsychiatric SLE exists. So in many patients of young stroke, CVT, many patients with strokes or with headache, seizures during pregnancy, we should consider neurolupus, specifically if we are having a background of systemic connective tissue disorder. So we should know that it is associated with increased risk of mortality, thrombosis, infections, preterm labor, as well as eclampsia. So there's something known as lupus cerebritis, in which we find inflammation in CSF. So lupus vasculitis is equally common, and we should have a lower threshold specifically in women presenting to us with these complaints during the reproductive age group. Then we have neurojograns. Just a passing comment, again, Jograns is much more common in women of younger age group. With the predisposition, there are almost 9 times more prone to develop neurojogrons as compared to their male counterparts, though they can be having gangliopathy and can be having isolated cranial neuropathies with fifth and eighth cranial nerve involvement. It is important to know its relationship with NMOSD or neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder, and hence telling us that it can just present with myelopathy. So only a high risk of suspicion will lead us to this diagnosis and the investigations. Systemic sclerosis, again more common in women. Importantly, it is associated with inflammatory myopathy. So patients who present to us with these symptoms, with skin thickening and inflammatory myopathy, systemic sclerosis should be there in the hindsight. Inflammatory muscle disease, again more common in women, and now we have n number of antibodies which have been recognized to be present with inflammatory muscle disease. And how can I forget EPLA while I'm talking about women and neuroimmunology? Antiphospholipid antibody syndrome needs to come, and we need to know that it can be associated with arterial or venous thrombosis, and specifically in case there are fetal losses during pregnancy, along with this thrombosis, along with strokes or CVTs, EPLA should be considered and ruled out sufficiently. So from here I come to my key points. So neuroimmunology is not just multiple sclerosis, it is much beyond multiple sclerosis, and specific issues in women need to be addressed with regards to demography, diagnosis, prognosis, pregnancy, lactation, and menopause. So these neuroimmunological disorders are very potentially treatable and extremely, at times they are almost curable disorders. So they need to figure in our differential diagnosis whenever dealing with patients who present with neuroimmunological syndromes. And at the end, I would again like to end this talk with this quote: the only thing tough enough to beat a person is a person itself. Thank you.